Hi guys, MrRoflWaffles here. Today we'll be walking through the entire seasonal artifact for the Season of Reclamation, also known as the season during the Edge of Fate in Destiny 2. We'll start by reading through all of the artifact perks, and I'll then show you some synergies across the different perks so that you can start getting a feel for which ones you might want to enable to create some crazy builds. And while some of these are things that you might have seen similar things to before, I'm going to read them in their entirety anyway, just to make sure that we're being comprehensive for the video. So in column 1, we have Anti-Barrier Scout and Pulse. Your equipped scout rifles and pulse rifles fire shield-piercing rounds and stun barrier champions. Unstoppable sidearm and hand cannon. Aiming down the sights of a hand cannon or sidearm for a short time loads a powerful payload that stuns unshielded combatants, strong against unstoppable champions. Then Unstoppable Sniper Rifle. Aiming down the sights of a sniper rifle for a short time loads a powerful payload that stuns unshielded combatants, and that's strong against unstoppable champions as well. Overload Shotgun. Your equipped shotguns fire disrupting rounds which stun the target, delaying ability energy regeneration and lowering combatant damage output, strong against overload champions. And finally, Overload Rapid Fire, where uninterrupted fire from your equipped auto rifles and submachine guns grants bullets that stun combatants, delaying ability energy regeneration and lowering combatant damage output, strong against overload champions. That's column 1. We all know how column 1 usually works, so these are really no surprise. Let's move on to column 2. Flame, Fiber, and Freeze combines the Solar/Strand and Solar/Stasis Siphon mods into one. So if you're planning a build where you've got both Solar and then either Strand or Stasis weapons, this is quite a nice pickup. Next is Diviner's Discount. All Scavenger mods are discounted. Then we've got one with Frost. While Frost Armor is active, Stasis weapons gain increased reload speed and stability. Stasis swords gain increased guard resistance as well. And there are several other Frost Armor related perks on the artifact this season, so we'll come back to this in a moment. Next is Tightly Woven. While Woven Mail is active, gain increased super and grenade stats. And again, Woven Mail comes up a couple of times, so we'll come back to this. And then final perk for the second column is Rapid Precision Rifling. Rapid precision hits or final blows with scout rifles grants them increased reload and reduced incoming flinch. I think for the most part, a lot of people are not big scout rifle fans, so this looks like maybe a little effort to try and change that a little bit, but we're gonna have to wait and see for whether anyone actually cares or if scout rifles are still just kind of trash. Next, for our third column, we've got Fever and Chill. Rapid precision hits with solar weapons grant Radiant. Rapid precision hits with stasis weapons grant Frost Armor. So that's another synergy with solar and then another element. You could maybe combine that with Flame, Fiber, and Freeze, one perk to the left of this. But let's keep going because we'll talk about proper synergies in a few minutes here. Next, we've got Elemental Benevolence. Granting allies an elemental buff gives class ability energy. Frost Renewal. While you have Frost Armor, taking critical damage releases a burst that freezes nearby combatants and grants Frost Armor to you and nearby allies. So this is essentially a way for you to sustain your Frost Armor. Next, we've got Reciprocal Draw. Rapid non-sidearm final blows grant sidearms a period of increased damage for a short time upon next draw. And Refresh Threads, where picking up an elemental pickup matching your subclass element or Tangle while you have a Strand super grants energy to your least charged ability. Now, there's several other things relating to Tangles and Strand and elemental pickups in the next columns, so let's keep moving. First of all, we've got Threaded Blast. Destroying a Tangle with Strand damage increases the radius of the explosion and its damage. Next, we've got Cauterized Darkness. Stasis or Strand debuffed non-boss combatants take increased solar damage from all sources. So again, another synergy here between solar and then either Strand or Stasis. Next, we've got Elemental Daze. Stunning a champion with an elemental weapon creates an elementally aligned explosion, applying a matching elemental debuff to them and nearby targets. And so that would synergize very well with the perk right above it that we just read, Cauterized Darkness, because you could stun a champion with a Stasis or Strand weapon. That could then elemental debuff nearby targets around you, and then you could swap to a solar weapon, and that would do more damage because you've got Cauterized Darkness enabled. We'll talk about some fun ways to make that even more juicy, but for now, let's keep moving. Shoulder to Shoulder is the next perk, where dealing sustained precision damage against combatants while near 2 or more allies grants you damage resistance. And I believe this works as stacks, so if there's 3 of you, you'll have a little ×3 buff, whereas if there's more of you, then you'll have a ×4 or a ×5 or a ×6, and that will grant you increased damage resistance. Then final perk for column 4 is Elemental Coalescence. Defeating targets has the chance to create an elemental pickup matching your equipped super element. Then moving on to column 5, our first perk is Radiant Shrapnel, dealing sustained weapon damage while radiant, or defeating a scorched combatant with a weapon causes the target to release solar projectiles that deal damage and scorch on impact. That's a bit of a mouthful, but to translate it into slightly more intelligible text, basically if you're radiant or if the enemy is scorched and you do weapon damage to it, it'll emit some extra solar projectiles that then can scorch stuff around it. The next perk is Shield Crush. While you have Woven Mail, Frost Armor, or a Void Overshield, your melee recharges faster and deals increased damage. And while you are amplified or radiant, your grenade recharges faster and deals increased damage. So this one's got a lot of uses. It's almost 2 perks in one in my mind. And so we'll link this to several other perks when we run through some of the synergies in just a second here. The next perk is Elemental Overdrive. Picking up an elemental pickup or tangle grants increased damage to weapons of the same element. Next is Tangled Web. Creating a tangle by defeating a strand debuffed target suspends nearby combatants. And finally, Frigid Glare. While Frost Armor is active, Stasis Precision Final Blows cause combatants to release a freezing burst. Now, before we talk synergies, it's also important to recognize that with the artifact now, we also have new gear bonuses, and these new gear bonuses can change. Now, I believe that's down to what you've actually got in the slot, but I'm actually not 100% sure on this particular point. But I'm going to show you 2 examples of the bonuses that I've had. So when all 5 of your armor slots are filled with armor that is new gear from the Season of Reclamation, you will gain a 7.8% damage resistance buff just for free, just by virtue of having picked each of your armor items from the new gear. However, you're unlikely to be doing that because you're probably going to be using an exotic from a previous season, and so you would usually have a smaller damage resistance buff than the maximum, which I think is 7.8%. There's also buffs to weapons, and I think I understand how these work because the buffs are variable. So just hear me out here. As you can see in this shot, I've got 3 pieces of new gear equipped. And so for all of those, I'm getting a new gear buff in slot. So my kinetic slot, energy slot, and power slot are all getting that flat 6% buff. However, I think if you equip a new gear exotic to one of your weapon slots, that slot will then get a 15% boost instead of a 6% boost. So in this clip, I've got one of the new exotics in my energy slot, and my energy slot buff is then 15%. Now, I don't think that this is related to artifact level. I think it's just based on being exotic, but I could be mistaken about this. So I apologize if I'm wrong, but this is what I've sort of gathered so far. I'd now like to draw your attention to the spreadsheet that I've created. Yay! We love spreadsheets, right? Just me? Okay. I'll be excited about it and you guys can reap the benefits. How about that? So, what I've done is I've written out all of the perks here, and I've done some color coding and tab separating as well, so that we can work through some of the different options and different synergies that the artifact presents this season. Let's start with Frost Armor as an example, and then we'll move on to the others here. So just bear with me while I explain the way that I've set this up. It will all make perfect sense in the next sort of 60 seconds. So what I've done is I've highlighted yellow if it's something that gives you Frost Armor, and blue if it just mentions Frost Armor, like while Frost Armor is active, okay? And to make this really easily visually intelligible, I've copied them into their own line here, and this line below basically just cuts out any of the other information. So this, for example, is talking about Amplified and Radiant and all this other stuff. I've just cut it down so it's just what it talks about for Frost Armor, just in case that's the only thing you want to tunnel vision in on for the time being. So let's talk through how Frost Armor is affected by the artifact, and then we'll talk about how we can synergize that with the other stasis stuff. To begin with, with, you can get Frost Armor, that's why this is yellow, from rapid precision hits with stasis weapons. And then once you've got it, all of these things become possible. While Frost Armor's active, stasis weapons gain increased reload speed and stability. Stasis precision final blows cause combatants to release a freezing burst, so that's you dishing out final blows. But there's also Frost Renewal, which also affects when you're the one getting blown. So while you have Frost Armor, taking critical damage releases a burst that freezes nearby combatants, just like this does, and it grants Frost Armor to you and nearby allies. So you can actually argue that this should be yellow because this is a way for you to sort of juggle your Frost Armor, like you can get it again from this. So final blows, freezing burst, you nearly die, freezing burst, and you get Frost Armor back. And finally, while you have Frost Armor, your melee recharges faster and deals increased damage. So a hypothetical chain for what you could do here is you could be going for your precision final blows, and then when your melee is full, you could go into a scenario where you go for the melee that deals increased damage. That situation might bring you down to lower health, which will cause a freezing burst to freeze more enemies, and it will give you Frost Armor back, and then you can kind of rinse and repeat. You can get a bunch of faster reloads here as well, and that's happy days. You'll have Frost Armor uptime all the time. The question is, how might this synergize with some of the other stasis stuff? So I'm adding a new color here, right? To reiterate, yellow was a way for you to get Frost Armor. The sort of electric blue was what you can do while you have Frost Armor active, but then this new blue is just stuff that affects stasis. So we understand our flow from what we talked about down here, but now, because we're getting Frost Armor from rapid precision hits with stasis, you can link that to Elemental Overdrive over here, where picking up an Elemental Pickup grants increased damage to weapons of the same element. So if you're picking up a stasis Elemental Pickup, that will grant your stasis weapons more damage, and if you're wondering how to get those Elemental Pickups more frequently, then you can always go with Elemental Coalescence if you've got a stasis super on, because then defeating targets has the chance to create elemental pickups matching your equipped super. And if you're on a stasis subclass, then picking up those elemental pickups matching that subclass will also grant ability to your least charged ability, so that's just a little bit more ability uptime. And then these two here, Cauterized Darkness and Flame Fiber and Freeze, really synergize with each other as well, because assuming you're on stasis, you're doing a lot of stasis debuffing, right? That's probably part of the aspects and fragments that you're going to be equipping, and that will be happening anyway based on the fact that you'll be freezing nearby combatants. So there'll be lots of stasis debuffs to go around, and that will mean that non-boss combatants take increased solar damage from all sources, right? Which also happens to link to Fever and Chill, where rapid precision hits with solar weapons give you Radiant. So if you're on mostly stasis subclass stuff, but you're also using a solar weapon, then what you can do is you can use that weapon to finish enemies off once they are frozen, and that will then give you Radiant as well. And for the icing on the cake then, because you're using solar and stasis, you can combine the siphon mods into one and generate more orbs. So there's a ton of synergy here, and you hopefully now see why I've color-coded it this way, because I think it really helps you sort of understand that this is where the Frost Armor is going to be coming from, aside from other sources, obviously. This is just where it's coming from within the artifact specifically, and then these electric blues are what you do while it's up, and the stasis blues are other ways you can kind of build into it to maximize your potential. And this is hopefully making it clear why in the thumbnail I had the Lord of Wolves and I had a lot of stasis crystals behind it with a frozen captain, right? Because you're going to be absolutely shredding stuff with Lord of Wolves if stuff is already frozen, based on the fact that it's a solar weapon, so your solar damage will be increased, and rapid solar hits will grant you Radiant, and all of those things can happen with the Lord of Wolves. So that gun is going to have a nice time, I'd imagine, in this season. So let's now do the same thing for Woven Mail, because Woven Mail is mentioned twice. It's not a lot of times to mention it, but it's there. So I've done the exact same thing. I've copied it down here, and I've cut out the extra detail on this row. So while Woven Mail is active, gain increased super and grenade stats, and while you have Woven Mail, your melee recharges faster and deals increased damage. So to be honest, there's not a huge amount of synergy between these two things, I would say. But if instead we look at this from the perspective of tangles, then that changes things slightly. So let's scroll down here to read all these together and understand how they synergize just at face value before we add the rest of the strand interactions in. So destroying a tangle with strand damage increases the radius of the explosion and its damage. Strand debuffed non-boss combatants take increased solar damage. creating a tangle by defeating a strand debuff target suspends nearby combatants. Picking up a tangle while you've got a strand super grants energy to your least charged ability. And picking up a tangle grants increased damage to weapons of the same element as well. So again, it's not quite as cohesive as the Frost Armor one in my view, but the sort of flow here roughly is that you're in tangle generation mode, you're creating tangles, and doing so suspends nearby combatants, which means that they are strand debuffed, which means you can create more tangles. So this is kind of a tangle generation loop, so long as you have a way to strand debuff them in the first place. Then when you're doing that tangle generation, if you pick them up while you've got strand super, you'll get energy for your least charged ability, and your weapons will do more damage as well if they're strand weapons. Then using that more damage strand weapon will cause an increased radius explosion, which does more damage if you destroy a tangle that you're infinitely generating with Tangled Web. And then finally, all of the extra suspension and other debuffs that you're applying here will then take increased solar damage from all sources. So once again, it's a similar situation to what I was saying about stasis, where if you're finishing enemies with solar, then that's going to give you a little bit of extra damage, and it's going to then grant you radiant, which is quite nice. And the same applies with strand here, where you're going to want to do all this stuff on the right-hand side, but then if you've got a non-boss combatant that is strand debuffed, switch to a solar weapon, finish it off, get your radiant, and you can use flame fiber freeze there as well. But actually, really, we should move on to this tab so that I can show you this with the color coding. So like I said, if you're switching to solar to final blow those non-bosses that are strand debuffed, you can also have flame fiber and freeze on, and that way your siphon mods will be combined into one for solar and strand. So then on top of that, it's important not to forget the fact that there's these woven mail buffs, so you can gain increased super and grenade stats and also get melee recharge faster as well. And then still assuming that you have a strand super on, you can get elemental pickups from defeating targets while you've got that super equipped, and to help you juggle the number of targets that you are suspending and just overall the targets that you are strand debuffing, you can use elemental days, and that's for champions specifically, but it will mean that you get this elementally aligned explosion, applying that debuff to nearby targets. So where Frost Armor was all about juggling the Frost Armor and juggling freezes, this one is all about, again, still trying to juggle those debuffs, but a lot of the juice, in my view, comes from the tangle generation loop that you're able to do with Tangled Web. And then you've got those solar kind of synergies that I mentioned for it as well. I guess it's also worth mentioning that if you're doing that juggle at the end of your kind of kill chain, where you're switching to a solar weapon to do extra solar damage, and then you're getting rapid precision hits with solar, and that's giving you radiant, the final piece of the puzzle will be that by getting radiant, you'll also get faster grenade recharge and deal increased damage with your grenade. And so you can just toss a load more of those out as you play as well. So that's the strand view of things. Let's do radiant and solar now, because this one's really juicy. Especially for me, because I love playing Solar Warlock. So just like we did before, we've got a source of Radiant here, and then we've got some things you can do while Radiant. So let's scroll down to our simplified version. Rapid precision hits with solar weapons grant Radiant. So that's another source of Radiant for us. Then dealing sustained weapon damage while Radiant causes the target to release solar projectiles that deal damage and scorch on impact. And the nice thing about Radiant Shrapnel is it is another one that's going to kind of cyclically loop, because once we release those solar projectiles that deal damage and scorch, we then just need to deal sustained weapon damage to those scorched enemies with a weapon, and that's going to cause those new scorched enemies to release more projectiles that will scorch more enemies, that will then shoot with a weapon to scorch more other enemies, and then shoot them with a weapon to scorch more other enemies, etc, etc. Then finally, while Radiant, like I said, your grenade recharges faster and deals increased damage as well. So let's look at how this synergizes with solar specifically. So first of all, we're using a solar weapon here, right? We've specified that we're using a solar weapon to get loads of Radiant uptime. And that means Elemental Daze is viable, where stunning a champion with an elemental weapon, solar in this case, creates a solar explosion, applying solar elemental debuffs to the champion and nearby targets. So that's going to sort of be a similar flow for you to Radiant Shrapnel, where you're just scorching everything. And then crucially, I think very, very importantly for this one, you're going to want Elemental Coalescence on, because that's going to create elemental pickups matching your equipped super. And assuming you're using a solar super, those elemental pickups would then give you access to this, for instance, where picking up those pickups grants increased damage to weapons of the same element. equipment, and they'd be solar pickups, so you'd get increased damage to solar weapons, and it's solar weapons that, like we said here, giving you radiant when you get rapid precision hits with them. And so that's going to be an important part of the kind of flow here as well. And then on top of that, like we said before, we've got things like refresh threads, where if you get an elemental pickup matching your subclass and you've got a solar subclass on, then you're going to get energy for your least charged ability. So that's just going to help with overall ability uptime. And you can get class ability from this as well. I think if you're like healing nading your teammates, for example, then you're going to get class ability energy from that as well. So lots of really strong solar synergies here. But I think that where a lot of these sort of build synergies shine is when you're using stasis or strand, and then you're flowing into solar. And so when you're on just solar, you're ever so slightly more limited. It's not by a huge amount, but for example, with your Cauterized Darkness here, you're only getting that increased solar damage from all sources, which is pretty big that it's everything, it's not just weapons. If you've got the stasis and strand debuff up, and if you're a solo player and you're just doing everything building into solar, then you're never going to be stasis or strand debuffing anything at all. And then similarly, if you're full solar, then Flame Fiber and Freeze is also much less useful for you. And it's a little awkward because if you think about how you're building into the artifact, thus far in the video, I've just been highlighting things like crazy. Like I've just been doing whatever highlights would have a synergy and letting you guys pick. But obviously to get to the right-hand side of the artifact tree, you need to get through these left columns. And if you're only solar, there's much less point you choosing this. And then this is Frost Armor and Stasis. This is Woven Mail, and this is Scout Rifles. So like you're kind of burning a few artifact points here just to get to the further parts of the tree. And so that's why I think having a small part of your kit being stasis or strand might be hypothetically a good idea, but also maybe you disagree. Maybe you see something here that I don't. I totally think that that will happen because I'm looking at this for the first time before the embargo. So I would love you guys to leave comments with what you think the best, strongest synergies are going to be here and what you think the best kind of overall flow in gameplay is going to be for how you're going to do your damage rotations and make the most out of these different artifact perks. I've tried my best to lay it out for you guys in a way that would help you kind of build craft and theory craft. Maybe I'll just quickly turn my camera on here for the last bit of this. If you've got any feedback for the way that I've done this video, I would love to hear it. I've tried really hard to be helpful, but I also recognize that my knowledge is limited because I'm newer to the game. And so I've tried to serve it up in a way that means that you guys can cook as well. So thank you so much for watching. I've been MrRoflWaffles. I'm posting a bunch of other Edge of Fate videos explaining all the other features and a bunch of early gameplay and stuff like that as well. That's all on my channel, so make sure you're subscribed first of all, but then second, there'll be some of it linked on the screen right now, just over there. So click through and I'll hopefully see you there. Bye for now.